There is a painful truth about relationships with avoidant individuals: they rarely leave on the day they actually say goodbye. Most of the time, the departure began long before that, in the way they started seeing you, in the way they withdrew into silence, in the way they slowly pulled back without giving you a clear reason. On the surface, everything may still look intact. You still text, still meet, still maintain some form of connection, but on a deeper psychological level, they may have already started separating themselves from the relationship much earlier than you realized. And that is exactly what makes this kind of heartbreak so confusing, even haunting. The person left behind is not only hurt because they were abandoned, they are hurt because they do not understand what changed. Because they tried so hard and still could not save what was quietly falling apart. Because they keep asking themselves, "What did I do wrong?" But from the perspective of attachment psychology, the more important question is not where you failed. It is what is happening inside the emotional world of an avoidant person when they begin to retreat. In this video, I am not here to give you empty comfort. I want to take you deeper into the psychological mechanisms behind avoidant distancing, why they shift from closeness to coldness, why they choose silence instead of explanation, and why many breakups are actually prepared long before they are spoken aloud. If you have ever loved an avoidant person and felt like you were always the last to know what they truly felt, stay with me until the end of this video. And if you want to better understand avoidant psychology and learn how to protect your heart without losing your self-worth, subscribe to the channel and follow this journey with me. Before we talk about the 4 specific signs, we need to understand one very important foundation. People with an avoidant attachment style are not incapable of love, nor are they always as cold as they may appear. In reality, they still need love, still long for closeness, and still want to be understood just like anyone else. The problem is that alongside this desire for connection, they also carry a deep fear of emotional intimacy. They fear becoming dependent on someone else, fear losing control over themselves, and even more deeply, they fear the feeling of being swallowed up by a relationship that becomes so close it seems to erase their inner space. That is why, for an avoidant person, love is not only a place of warmth and connection, but sometimes also a place that activates alarm signals in their nervous system. This helps explain why some avoidant individuals can seem very charming, present, and even emotionally deep in the early stages of love. But when the relationship begins to move into a safer, closer, and more clearly committed space, they start to change. It is not necessarily because their feelings disappear, but because that growing intimacy awakens their defenses. When the nervous system experiences closeness as a threat, they do not respond the way a secure person would. They do not sit down and clearly say, "I am scared," "I feel overwhelmed," or "I need to understand myself before I continue." Instead, they tend to gradually withdraw. They share less, initiate less, and express less emotion. Some suddenly become unusually busy. Some turn cold. Some avoid deeper conversations. And some remain physically present while emotionally separating themselves from the relationship. That is why being in a relationship with an avoidant person often leaves the other partner feeling confused. You can see the change, but you cannot fully understand where it is coming from. And this is exactly where the iceberg metaphor becomes so accurate. What you see above the surface is only the silence, the distance, the ambiguity, or the coldness. But that has never been the full truth. The submerged part is where the most important movements are taking place: fear of intimacy, self-protection, emotional contraction, and the need to regain a sense of autonomy. If you only look at the surface, You may think they stopped loving too quickly, but if you look deeper, you begin to understand that many times they do not leave because they feel nothing, but because they do not feel safe enough to stay in a relationship that requires real emotional openness. And from this point on, the 4 signs that follow no longer seem like random behaviors, but rather like very logical expressions of a psychological system quietly pulling away from attachment. The first sign, and also the most visible sign that an avoidant person is beginning to withdraw from a relationship, is that they gradually shift from softening your feelings to placing the blame on you. In the beginning, they usually do not want to appear as the one causing harm. So, their language often sounds gentle, even kind. They may say things like, "It's not your fault. You deserve someone better." Or, "I'm just not ready for a relationship." On the surface, these statements can make you believe they are being honest, trying to reduce your pain, or taking responsibility for their part. But in reality, many times, this is simply a layer of safe language that allows them to retreat without directly facing their guilt. The real issue is that as the emotional distance inside them grows, the way they narrate the relationship in their own mind also begins to change. Instead of seeing it as a meaningful connection with difficulties, they gradually reinterpret it as something suffocating, demanding, restrictive, or fundamentally painful. And when that inner narrative becomes strong enough, they stop speaking in vague, conflict-avoidant ways and begin openly assigning the cause of the breakdown to you. This is when statements such as "you are too emotional," "this relationship is toxic," or "being with you feels suffocating" start to appear. Psychologically, this is a very important shift, because blame is not just a moment of frustration. It is a mechanism that helps them reduce guilt as they leave. Once they turn you into the problem, their decision to withdraw feels more justified within their own belief system. In other words, they are not only leaving the relationship, they are rewriting its meaning in a way that helps them live with their decision more easily. That is why, when an avoidant person moves from avoiding conflict to openly blaming you, you need to understand that this is usually no longer a passing irritation. This is the point where their internal decision begins to harden, when the story in their mind has changed direction, and you shift from being someone they once loved to someone associated with pressure, exhaustion, or emotional pain. But blame is only the visible layer. The deeper, more dangerous part is that inside this relationship, they are already quietly becoming someone else. The second sign is deeper, more subtle, and in many ways far more painful. It is when the avoidant person begins to change their personal identity within the relationship from we to I. On the surface, this shift is not always loud. It does not necessarily appear through a cold declaration or a clear conversation about ending things. Instead, it often begins through very small changes that repeat themselves, often enough to create a visible pattern, new habits that no longer include you, weekend plans that slowly become individual plans, and sentences that once carried a shared spirit like "we will go," "we should do this together," or "the two of us should," gradually being replaced by "I will," "I'm planning to," or "I want to." From the outside, this may simply look like someone needing more personal space, becoming busier, or focusing more on themselves. But from the perspective of attachment psychology, this is often an internal process of separating the self from the relationship. They are not only creating behavioral distance, they are quietly removing you from the structure of their identity. In other words, they no longer experience themselves as a person rooted in we, but are beginning to experiment with life again as an independent time, separate and unbound. In psychological terms, This can be understood as a mismatch between their current relational role and the identity they are moving toward. Outwardly, they may still be your partner, still show up, still text, still keep the relationship alive in form. But inwardly, they have already begun practicing being single on a psychological level. They are getting used to the idea that their life can continue without your presence in it. And this is exactly why this kind of withdrawal hurts so deeply, because sometimes a breakup does not begin with a conversation. It begins the moment the other person no longer sees you as a natural part of who they are. When you are no longer present in the way they imagine their time, their plans, their role, and their everyday life. Real attachment has already started to fracture from within. It is a quiet shift, but a decisive one, because once someone begins redefining themselves outside the relationship, they are also preparing themselves for a version of the future that does not include you. And when identity changes, the next thing that usually disappears is the future. The third sign is often not loud or dramatic, but it is one of the clearest indications that an avoidant person is gradually withdrawing from the relationship they stop building a future with you. This is the stage where you begin to notice that topics which once felt natural between the two of you now become strangely difficult to reach. Conversations about an upcoming trip, holidays, moving in together, marriage, or any long-term plans begin to be avoided or answered vaguely. Instead of the excitement that once existed, all you get are responses like, "We'll see," "Let's think about it later," or "I don't know yet." On the surface, these reactions can easily be misunderstood as signs that they are simply busy, stressed, or not ready to decide too soon. But from a psychological perspective, this is often a sign that their time horizon is narrowing. When a person begins preparing internally to leave, they usually no longer want to imagine a future that includes both of you, because doing so creates too much inner conflict. On one hand, they are still present in the relationship, but on the other hand, psychologically, they have already begun separating themselves from the idea of long-term attachment, and to reduce that inner tension, they choose to shrink the relationship down to its safest form, the short-term present. So the relationship is not fully over yet, but it is no longer living inside the dimension of tomorrow. It continues to exist only through immediate routines, brief meetings, and interactions just sufficient enough to maintain the feeling that it is still here, but without any real foundation pointing forward. This is also what makes the experience so painful for the person left behind. You feel that something is fading, but you cannot clearly name what it is. There is no major fight, no decisive breakup announcement, only the feeling that the relationship is becoming smaller and smaller, as if the shared world you once built together is quietly shrinking. You are still in the relationship, but you no longer feel that you are being carried into their future. And that is the deepest pain, not a sudden disappearance, but the slow dissolving of a vision that once made you believe you were both moving in the same direction. So when the future disappears from the conversation, it is often not just busyness or temporary uncertainty. Very often, it is a sign that the feelings have already begun to leave before the breakup is ever spoken. But the deepest layer is not found in words or plans. It is found in values. The fourth sign is the deepest, the quietest, and also the one that makes an avoidant person's departure the hardest to reverse. Their value system is shifting. In the earlier stages, you may notice the change through the way they speak to you, the way they redefine themselves, or the way they stop building a shared future. But at this stage, the shift is no longer only about behavior or emotion. It is about how they begin to see life, themselves, and the relationship through a completely different framework. freedom starts to matter more than emotional bonding. Career, personal direction, or self-discovery begin to rank higher than shared time. Emotional presence, or even the commitments that once seemed meaningful, things that were once seen as what we are building together, such as time invested in the relationship, companionship, long-term plans, or the feeling of walking through life side by side may now gradually be seen as pressure, burden, or even limitation. This is the deepest stage of withdrawal because it is no longer simply about losing feelings. It is about changing one's direction in life from the inside out. And when a person's core values begin to change, they naturally start to look back at the relationship through a new lens. What once felt like a safe place can suddenly feel restrictive. What once felt like connection can be reinterpreted as confinement. What once made them feel loved may begin to feel like an emotional expectation they no longer want to carry. That is why, at this stage, the person left behind often feels especially powerless, because you are no longer dealing with someone who is merely confused for a moment or temporarily overwhelmed. You are dealing with someone who has begun to rearrange the priorities of their life. And in that new arrangement, the relationship no longer holds its former place. The most important thing to understand here is this: feelings can sometimes return, longing may still surface, and even regret can continue to exist after a breakup. But when a person's beliefs and life values have shifted, the chance that they will truly return to rebuild the same old relationship becomes very low. Because at this point, they are not only leaving a person, they are leaving behind an entire version of life they once accepted, and that is what makes this sign the most decisive of all. When values change, leaving is no longer a temporary emotional reaction. It becomes a direction rooted in identity. At this point, they are not just walking away from a relationship. They are following a new map for their life, and on that map, you may no longer exist. The most painful part of loving someone with avoidant tendencies is that you often believe everything ended suddenly. As if overnight, the person who once felt close to you became a stranger. Yesterday, they were still there, still texting, still present in some way. And then soon after, it feels as though you are standing in front of a door that had already been locked from the inside without any warning. That apparent suddenness is exactly what leaves the person behind feeling confused, wounded, and trapped in endless self-questioning. You keep asking yourself what happened, what you said wrong, what you lacked, or how a connection that once felt so meaningful could change so quickly. But the truth is that, for an avoidant person, a breakup rarely begins on the day they finally say it is over. Very often, that withdrawal has already been happening slowly inside them, quietly and almost invisibly. It begins when the way they see you starts to change. When they no longer experience you as a place of partnership, but gradually begin to experience the relationship as a source of pressure. It continues when they separate you from their identity, no longer naturally placing you in their plans, rôle, and personal rhythm of life the way they once did. Then, at some point, the shared future begins to fade, and the conversations that once pointed toward tomorrow become shorter, vague, and stripped of the feeling that the two of you are still moving forward together. Finally, the deepest shift happens when their value system changes, causing them not only to pull away from you emotionally, but also to leave behind the kind of life the two of you were once trying to build together. When you step back and see that whole process, you begin to understand that what ended was not simply a relationship in one moment, but a bond that had been slowly untied layer by layer long before the breakup was ever spoken aloud. And the most important thing you need to remember is this: it does not mean that you are not good enough. valuable enough, or worthy of deep love. Very often, you are not failing to keep someone from leaving. You are simply witnessing a very specific avoidant withdrawal mechanism, a defensive response that even they may not be fully conscious of while it is happening. Understanding that does not erase the pain completely, but it does help you stop turning the blade against yourself and begin to see the truth with a steadier heart. If you recognize all four of these signs in your relationship, the first thing you need to do is not panic, chase, or try to convince the other person to look back at you one more time. I know that is incredibly difficult, because when you love someone who is quietly leaving, the most natural reaction is often to do more, explain more, love harder, and sacrifice a little more in the hope that if you are sincere enough, they will return to the connection you once had. But from the perspective of emotional maturity, that is not the path to healing. More often, it is the path that causes you to lose yourself even faster. When someone has already begun withdrawing from the inside, what you need to understand is that you cannot use your devotion to reverse a psychological process that even they may not be fully ready to face. The more you try to convince someone who is leaving to see your worth, the more likely you are to fall into the position of having to prove your value to a person who is no longer in the same emotional reality as you. And that is when many people begin shrinking themselves, becoming less expressive, less needy, less honest about what they want, all just to keep the other person around a little longer. But healthy love is not built on you having to become a smaller, quieter, less demanding version of yourself in order to stay close to someone. What matters now is not continuing to chase vague signals. Analyze every text, every cold moment, or every time they come close, only to pull away again. What matters is having the courage to face the truth that this person may be leaving the relationship, and you cannot save a bond that only you are still trying to carry. Once you can see that truth, the next step is to stop blaming yourself. Do not turn their withdrawal into proof that you are not enough. Do not use their distance as evidence that you are too much, too sensitive, or too difficult to love. A securely attached person does not treat someone else's withdrawal as a verdict on their worth. They grieve, but they do not betray themselves in exchange for a vague possibility. They protect their dignity, hold their boundaries, and return to their self-respect. Because in the end, what saves you is not whether the other person comes back. What saves you is that you stop abandoning yourself while trying to keep someone who is already leaving. And perhaps the one sentence worth remembering most is this: emotionally mature people do not chase those who have quietly walked away. They choose to stay with themselves. If you have stayed with me until this point, I want you to remember something very important. Sometimes the most painful part is not that someone left, but that you stayed too long in a place where love was no longer being returned with genuine presence. Loving an avoidant person can train you to wait, to overread signals, to shrink your emotions just to keep the relationship from breaking apart. But true healing begins the moment you stop using someone else's withdrawal as a measurement of your worth. You do not need to become easier to love in order to be loved. You do not need to become less emotional, less needy, or less yourself in exchange for the presence of someone who is not ready to stay with their whole heart. Some relationships do not end because you lack value. They end because the other person is not capable of walking beside a love that requires maturity, clarity, and emotional presence. And if today you are standing in the middle of loss, confusion, and the painful feeling that you gave everything and still could not keep them, then please be gentle with yourself. Not every heartbreak is your fault. Not every departure means you were unworthy. Sometimes emotional maturity is not about being able to keep someone. It is about being wise enough not to keep losing yourself while trying to hold on to something that is already slipping away. Let this pain teach you how to return to your boundaries, your self-respect, and your trust that healthy love will never require you to constantly question your own worth. If this video spoke to something inside you, subscribe to the channel and stay with me for the next videos. Here, we are not only talking about avoidant people, but also about how you can become steadier, more secure, and able to love without abandoning yourself. And remember this, emotionally mature people do not chase those who have quietly walked away. They choose to stay with themselves. And from that place, they begin to rebuild their life.